Frost still crusted the fence posts when Marlena Tetterton walked the ditch line with a shovel over her shoulder. Her boots cracked through ice-skinned puddles. In her other hand, a bundle of gray, shriveled vine cuttings, roots wrapped in a feed sack, looked less like a crop and more like kindling. She knelt in the frozen dirt anyway. 1 hole, 2 holes, 10. Her breath came out in short white clouds as she pressed each brittle stick into the ground like she was burying something instead of planting it. By noon, half of Belhaven Hollow had heard about it. A woman planting dead wood in October, in a row facing the county road where every passing truck could see. Some folks laughed behind their coffee cups at the diner. Others just shook their heads and kept driving. Marlena never looked up once, never explained herself to a single soul who slowed down to stare. She only tamped the soil down tighter around each cutting, like she was daring the ground to prove her wrong. Nobody in that hollow could say what she was really planting, or why she'd bet everything on wood that looked long past saving. If you're the kind of person who believes something plain can still hold a secret worth waiting for, you're exactly who this channel was built for. Go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know what corner of the world you're watching from tonight. I like picturing all those little dots on the map while I tell you these stories. Ozark County, Missouri, doesn't show up on many maps unless you're looking for it. Belhaven Hollow sits at the bottom of a valley where the fog pools every morning like milk in a bowl, and the nearest stoplight is 11 miles off. Farms there run on hay, cattle, and stubbornness, passed down the same as the land. Marlena's people had worked 40 acres along Sugar Camp Creek for 4 generations, though by the time it landed in her hands, it was mostly scrub pasture and an old barn with a roof that sighed every time the wind picked up. She'd come back to Belhaven 2 years earlier, after her husband's rig accident left her a widow with a mortgage-free house and precious little else. Her daughter, Birdie, was 11 then, all elbows and questions, and together they'd learned to live on garden vegetables, a few laying hens, and whatever Marlena could piece together mowing yards and mending fence for neighbors who paid in cash or canned goods. The land was hers. The back taxes on it, 4 years unpaid from her father's final illness, were not going away. Every evening Marlena kept the same small ritual. She'd set the kettle on, pull out her grandmother Octavia's cedar recipe box, and thumb through the index cards for no real reason except that it smelled like the woman who raised her. One night, tucked behind a card for blackberry cobbler, she found something else, a yellowed letter, and pressed flat inside it, a single dried grape leaf. She didn't understand it yet. She only knew her hands went still holding it, the way hands go still around something they sense matters before the mind catches up. The county tax office wasn't gentle about the timeline. A notice came in September, stamped and certain. Pay the balance in full by the first Saturday of October, or the 40 acres would go up on the courthouse steps at public auction. Marlena read it twice at the kitchen table, then folded it small enough to fit in her apron pocket, where it stayed for 3 days before she told anyone at all. When she finally did, it wasn't Birdie she told first. It was her late husband's uncle, Addie's Junger, the only man in the hollow who still dropped by uninvited to check her fence lines. Addie stood at the end of that new-planted row with his thumbs hooked in his overalls, studying the gray sticks like they'd personally offended him. "Marlena," he said, drawing her name out slow, "them's dead. I don't care whose they were. A vine don't come back from that." She didn't argue. She just handed him the letter she'd found in the recipe box. The ink faded, but the handwriting unmistakably her grandmother's, describing a grape her family had carried west from Virginia before the First War. A variety, the letter said, that vintners once traveled 2 counties over just to taste. Addie's read it twice, the way careful men do, then handed it back without much change in his face. "Letter don't change what dead wood does," he said. "And you got 4 weeks and a courthouse date bearing down on you. Whatever this is, girl, it ain't going to save the farm by October." Marlena folded the letter along its old crease and tucked it back in her apron. She didn't say he was wrong. She only picked her shovel back up and kept working, because somewhere underneath the doubt, she'd already decided the row was going in the ground whether the timeline made sense or not. She worked the row like it owed her an answer. Mornings before the hens were fed, she'd be out there soaking burlap in buckets to wrap the base of each cutting against frost. She read every dog-eared viticulture pamphlet the extension office would mail her, sounded out words like cambium and graft union at the kitchen table with Bertie correcting her pronunciation for fun. Bertie, for her part, took to calling the row Mama's ghost sticks, not unkindly, and helped haul water after school, her small hands turning the soil soft around each buried cutting like she was tucking in something asleep. Word around the co-op store was less kind. A man named Delford Rasco, who ran the feed counter and had opinions about everything grown within 20 miles, told anybody who'd listen that Marlena Tetterton had lost her sense along with her husband. Spite farming, he called it, on account of the county extension agent having told her flat out, months before, that reviving old grape rootstock on marginal land was a fool's errand not worth the fertilizer. Marlena had heard him say it to her face in the parking lot. She hadn't argued then either. She'd simply gone home and planted the row 2 days later. Late November brought the first real test. A hard freeze rolled through 2 weeks earlier than the almanac promised, dropping temperatures into the teens overnight while Marlena's burlap wrap sat half-finished in the barn. She woke before dawn to check the row and found nearly a third of the cuttings blackened at the tips, the tissue gone soft and wrong beneath her thumbnail. She stood in that frozen row a long while, breath fogging, saying nothing. Bertie found her there 20 minutes later, still standing, and asked in a small voice if the ghost sticks were dying for real this time. That night Marlena nearly quit. She sat at the table with the tax notice in front of her and did the arithmetic plainly. The money she'd need, the buyers she didn't have, the grapes that wouldn't produce fruit for years, even if every remaining cutting somehow took root. It was Bertie who pulled Octavia's letter back out of the recipe box and set it in front of her mother without a word, tapping one line with her finger. The part where the old woman had written that the vine had survived a flood, a fire, and a depression, and would surely outlive whoever doubted it next. Marlena went back out to the row before sunrise. She cut away every blackened tip with clean shears, the way the extension pamphlets described for frost damage, and repacked the surviving cuttings with fresh mulch and every burlap scrap she owned. She didn't know yet if it would matter. She only knew quitting wouldn't buy her a single extra day past that October auction date, so she might as well spend the time she had left doing the one thing that still felt like hers to control. Ottie's watched her from his truck one morning, and, for the first time, didn't say a word. By late winter, thin green shoots had pushed up along 9 of the surviving cuttings, curling tender and pale against the gray wood like something reaching for a hand. Marlena trained each one up a length of twine with the careful patience of a woman who had run out of other options. She wrote to a small agricultural university 2 states over, describing the leaf shape and the letter's account of the vine's Virginia origins, and mailed a single pressed leaf along with her note, not expecting much of anything to come back before her deadline arrived. The reply came in early September, 3 weeks before the auction date, from a woman named Verley Ashcraft, an ampelographer, a specialist in grapevine identification, who'd spent a career tracking down old American rootstock thought lost to Prohibition-era vine pulling. Verley's letter was careful, almost disbelieving in tone, asking permission to visit and take cuttings for genetic testing. She used a word Marlena had to look up: orphan, a variety with no living commercial planting anywhere on record. Marlena read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then folded it into her apron pocket beside the auction notice, and said nothing to Delford Rasco at all. Verley Ashcraft arrived on a Tuesday in a university pickup loaded with sample bags and a notebook already half full. She walked the row slowly, turning leaves over in her fingers, photographing the trunk of each surviving vine, murmuring to herself in a way that made Ottie's, leaning on the fence nearby, visibly nervous. By the time she left 3 hours later, she'd taken cuttings from every plant, filled 6 pages of notes, and told Marlena carefully, like a woman not wanting to promise too much, that if the genetics matched what the letter described, this could matter to people well beyond Ozark County. The auction notice sat on the courthouse bulletin board through the last week of September, Marlena's name and parcel number printed plain for anyone to read. Delford Rasco read it out loud at the feed counter more than once, not unkindly exactly, just certain of how this story was going to end. Marlena kept working the row anyway, tying up new growth, walking the fence line each evening with Bertie, watching the county road for a mail truck that might or might not bring word back from a university lab before the first Saturday of October ever arrived. Word came 4 days before the auction, not from the university, but from Verley herself, calling the only working phone in the hollow, the one bolted to the wall at the co-op store. Delford Rasco answered it. He listened, went quiet, then walked out from behind the counter still holding the receiver by its cord, out into the gravel lot, hollering for somebody to go fetch Marlena Tetterton, because there was a woman on the line from some university lab saying words like pre-prohibition cultivar and commercially extinct, and she didn't sound like she was joking one bit. Saturday morning, the 1st of October, the courthouse steps in town filled up the way they did for any public auction, county men in canvas coats, a few land speculators from over toward Springfield, the auctioneer setting up his card table and gavel. Marlena stood near the back with Bertie's hand in hers, the tax balance still unpaid, expecting the worst and trying to look like she wasn't. She hadn't told anyone what Verley's phone call had actually said. She'd barely let herself believe it. She just watched the crowd gather and waited for her parcel number to be called. Before the auctioneer reached her name, 3 unfamiliar trucks pulled up along the courthouse curb, out of state plates dusty from the drive. Grown men and women climbed out in muddy boots, cameras and notebooks in hand, asking around for the Tetterton place before the auctioneer had even opened his mouth. One carried a printed article, folded soft from handling, with a photograph of Marlena's row on the front page of a viticulture trade newsletter. The headline nomming a rediscovered pre-prohibition grape variety, found alive on 40 acres in Ozark County, Missouri. The crowd on the steps went quiet, then started murmuring, then started turning to stare at Marlena instead of the auctioneer. Within the hour, what had been a tax auction turned into something else entirely. 2 boutique winery owners and a preservation nonprofit representative were standing in the courthouse lot with checkbooks out, not bidding on Marlena's land, but asking about licensing rights to propagate cuttings, about contracts, about whether she'd consider selling scion wood come spring. The county clerk, visibly unsure how to process any of it, ended up simply accepting a certified payment on the back taxes directly from Marlena's hand, money from an advance contract signed on the hood of Verley's university truck 20 minutes earlier, and striking her parcel number clean off the auction list. Delford Rasco stood near the courthouse steps the whole time, saying nothing, watching strangers photograph a woman he'd called foolish for a full year straight. Ottie's Junger stood a little closer, arms crossed, a look on his face that wasn't quite a smile yet but was heading that direction. Bertie held tight to her mother's hand through all of it, watching the same road that had once carried only mockery, now carrying trucks full of people who'd driven hundreds of miles for cuttings off 9, surviving vines her mother had refused to dig up. By the following spring, Marlena's 40 acres along Sugar Camp Creek carried a small commercial nursery contract, 3 winery partnerships, and a waiting list of collectors hopping for scion wood off what agricultural papers were now calling the Tetterton Heritage Vine. She kept the original row exactly as it was, gnarled and modest beside the newer plantings, refusing every suggestion to tear it out and start clean. Some mornings she still found Ottie's leaning on that same fence, no longer studying the vines like they'd offended him. Just watching the new leaves catch the light the way a man watches something he's glad he was wrong about. Delford Rasco never did apologize outright, not in so many words, though he started stocking grafting tape at the co-op store that same season, and never once mentioned spite farming again. Bertie kept a pressed leaf from the original row tucked inside her own copy of Octavia's recipe box, a habit she'd picked up without anyone teaching her. Marlena still walks that first row some evenings, past the gnarled old wood that once looked like nothing but kindling to everyone but her, and she'll tell you, if you ask, that the county never did learn to call it dead wood again, not once they watched it outlive every single thing that was supposed to bury it.